Islamic terror isn't just menacing New York City, of course. It's an even greater problem in Europe, where decades of slow immigration have accelerated to become a wave of migrants that has completely changed the demographic mix of that continent, not to mention the daily lives of the people who live there. Pull up your mental image of Sweden. Pacifism, socialism, blonde people, mandatory politeness, lilting accents, saunas, you know the cliche. If that's what you're picturing, you haven't been there recently. Here is the scene in Malmo, that's the country's third largest city, just the other day. It may look like Karachi or Cairo, but again, that is Sweden. It's changed quite a bit. A generation ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find Swedes marching in support of religiously motivated mass murder. Now, it's all but normal, thanks to mass immigration that has brought tens of thousands of immigrants into that country from North Africa and the Middle East. Malmo has been called Europe's most anti-Semitic city, with dozens of verbal and physical attacks targeting the few hundred Jews who still live there. Just 75 years ago, Sweden was a haven for Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Today, those same Jews fear their own neighbors again, thanks to the Swedish government's decision to bring in a population that hates them. Just 2 days ago, a synagogue in Sweden was firebombed. It wasn't the first such attack, and unfortunately, it will likely not be the last. Meanwhile, in Paris, Muslim immigrants have taken over the city streets in some parts of the capital. Residents of one neighborhood are threatening a hunger strike if camping migrants aren't moved by the end of the year. They say trash is everywhere, and worse, women are being harassed regularly on the street. Mark Stein is an author and columnist who's followed what's happening in Europe for some time, and he joins us tonight. So, Mark, you see videos like that from Sweden, and you realize that this is not the continent that you picture, that it really is completely different because of immigration trends. Are the authorities in Europe, I know you spent a lot of time over there, aware of this? Do they care? Is there a public conversation about this?
Well, Tony Blair was asked by the late Christopher Hitchens about my book and whether the demographic trends in Europe were part of what he called the public conversation, the European conversation with his fellow prime ministers. And Tony Blair gave a very revealing answer, I thought. He said it's part of the subterranean conversation.
Right, exactly.
In other words, Europe's leaders haven't figured out a way to talk about this in public. I know Malmo very well. I've been there once or twice a year for the last 15 years. And the reason I go to Malmo is because it was the first Christian city in what was then Denmark, and it's now going to be the first Muslim city in Sweden. And I do something that I first did at the suggestion of a couple of those Swedish blondes you were mentioning, the ABBA girls, Britt Eklund, those kind of girls that you were talking about earlier, that they made one evening to me as I was sitting in a coffee shop. And at twilight, I walked from downtown Malmo to Rosengård, which is the big Muslim suburb. And the Swedish blondes thin out, and the covered women and the bearded men come towards you, until eventually you're in a part of Sweden in which there are no uncovered women, and in which Muslim women who've come from Muslim countries where they didn't have to go covered, such as Bosnia, suddenly find they have to go covered when they emigrate to Sweden. That walk, as the blondes thin out and the big bearded men come towards you in ever greater numbers, that is Europe's future walking towards you. And I would say it's the biggest story of our time.
Yes.
That Christendom is being transformed at an extraordinary level, to the point where Swedes will be an ethnic minority in their own country by mid-century.
But what I don't understand, why is no one allowed to talk about it? I mean, if Swedes or Danes or Finns were flooding into Jordan and displacing the native population and forcing people to follow their Christian practices and obey their cultural imperatives, their mores, I think liberals here would say, well, no, you can't do that. It's their country.
Right.
Why is it
Right.
different when it happens in Europe or the United States?
Well, you actually see it in the United States when they talk about New Orleans no longer being a chocolate city because too many white people have moved in. If you remember, that was one of the headlines a few years ago.
I do remember, yeah.
And I think that the problem, of course, is that the minute you raise it, you get accused of being racist. The minute you talk about it with any degree of honesty, that deputy leader of Britain First that you mentioned a couple of days ago, the police in Belfast flew all the way to London to arrest her, put her on a plane, take her back to Belfast for something she said in a speech at Belfast City Hall. Swedes are particularly dishonest about it. The wealthy Swedes, the minute their area gets like those scenes you were showing in Paris, where there's too many migrants and the neighborhood starts to change, they move out to all-white suburbs and all-white villages, and the moment they're there, they vote ever more enthusiastically in polls about how wonderful multiculturalism
but
is.
If
in other words, the more they move away from it, the more they are in favor of it.
Of course, because it doesn't affect them. But if you intentionally set out to create an environment in which violent nationalism would flower, wouldn't this be it?
Absolutely. I mean, the first duty of the political class is prudence. And you don't extinguish prudence for utopian delusions. And the reality is that people, as people know in almost any part of the world, that the minute you have Islam as 15 to 20% of your population, the mediation of relations between Islam and the rest of society becomes your principal domestic consideration, as is happening in front of our eyes in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, in the United Kingdom.
And it will happen here. The first duty of the political class is prudence. I'm getting that tattoo.
Absolutely.
And I'm giving you credit when I get it. Mark Stein, it's great to see you.
That's a great tramp stamp to get. I recommend that, Tucker.
It's true. Thank you.